Thanks for being here. It's kind of officially the first leadership speaker series, so very excited to have our MBA exec here, as well as all of our first years. Christine Dreas is going to do the honors of introducing Carolyn.
Hey everybody, welcome to our first leadership speaker series. I'm very excited today to introduce our wonderful speaker, a Darden alumna who I believe exemplifies Darden's mission to develop and inspire responsible leaders. After graduating from Darden, Carolyn Miles initially worked in the private sector in Hong Kong, both with American Express and as an entrepreneur. During her years in Asia, she came face to face with the endemic deprivation faced by millions of children. Moved by the dramatic juxtaposition of this poverty with the opportunities available to her own children, she dedicated herself to providing the world's children with better opportunities in life. Carolyn became the first woman to serve as president and CEO of Save the Children in September 2011, after she joined the organization in 1998 as the COO. She served in that role for 7 years. She also serves on the board of directors of Black Bod and on our very own Darden Foundation Board of Trustees. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Carolyn Miles.
So thank you so much for being here, and I know there's some people that aren't in the room. I think there's a room that this is being videoed to, so welcome to everybody. And it's always great to be back in Charlottesville. It's a little hot today, but it's still great to be back in Charlottesville. And I actually feel very passionately about giving back to Darden because I have a lot of Darden kind of connections or events that happened in my life. So I graduated in 1988. I just celebrated my 25th reunion from Darden. Can't quite believe that. But on the first day of Darden, I actually met my husband. So that's one connection. And I met him, actually, there used to be an event on the first day that a big beer truck would drive up. I don't know if we even do that anymore. My daughter tells the story that I met my husband under the beer truck. And I keep saying, no, I met him at the beer truck. And she's like, I know, but it sounds so much better to say that. So I met my husband here. You'll hear as I talk a little bit about what happened to my career after Darden, that a lot of the places that I ended up and the things that I did were because of connections with Darden, including ending up at Save the Children and doing the work that I have now been doing for 15 years, since 1998 at Save the Children. So lots and lots of Darden connections, and I do feel really passionately about giving back to Darden, and that's why I joined the board about 4 years ago. So very honored to be a board member here. And Dean Bruner was a finance teacher when I was here, and he was not the dean, but there's a huge amount of things that my education at Darden has really served me incredibly well. And so I thought I'd just talk about two things. One is I'll talk a little bit about my career and how did I end up being a Darden graduate and ending up running a large nonprofit organization called Save the Children. So talk a little bit about that and what happened along the way. And then I thought, this leadership series is about innovation, growth, and collaboration. And I thought rather than originally I stood there and kind of talked about, wrote a thing on innovation and a thing about growth, and I thought, I'm not actually going to talk about that. What I'd rather talk about is something that our organization is struggling with today that's very much in the news, which is Syria. So I'm going to talk to you about Syria, and I'm going to try to talk about the leadership issues that I'm facing around Syria and how that those leadership issues and questions are so important when you're in something like Syria, the current crisis that we're in, and I've been spending an awful lot of my time on that. So let me start just a little bit about, how did I get to Save the Children from Darden. Like many of you, I worked for a couple of years after college. I worked for a big corporation out in Chicago. And I was in sales, and somebody said to me, and I really loved marketing, and I knew that's the direction I wanted to go in, and they said, well, if you want to do that, you should go back to business school. So I hadn't been able to get in as an undergrad to UVA, so I said, all right, I'll try again, and applied to Darden. And I think what really did attract me to Darden was the focus on not just the learning about business, but the development of students as, a whole person and a very rounded person. And the case method obviously helps you do that. So I was really attracted to that. I came back to Darden had a great experience focused on marketing. That was really where my focus was. And after graduating in 1988, I went to New York and I worked for American Express for a couple years in New York, which if you're a marketing student, it is a great place to end up. It is a fantastic company to this day. They are a big partner with Save the Children. I have a huge amount of respect for American Express. So great opportunity, and worked in New York a couple years. And then they had a program that actually they chose about 5 people in their New York headquarters, and they said, did you want to go to an international post with American Express? They didn't tell you where you were going to go. They just said, would you like to do this? It was, a pretty prestigious program. I had gotten married by then. We got married right out of Darden, my husband and I. And I said, well, what about you? And he said, that sounds great. And I said, one lesson that I learned right there is your spouse and the flexibility that they have is really important in your career. So thinking about if you are going to get married and thinking about how do the two of you make those decisions. That particular decision, he was willing to go to Hong Kong with me. And so we went off, and I think the second lesson that I learned really quickly, in addition to having a spouse that supports you and is very flexible, is that you never know quite where your path's going to take you. We found out about a week before we were leaving that I actually was pregnant with our first child. That was not in the plan, but I figured they have a lot of children over there in Hong Kong. I'm sure we can manage this. So we went to Hong Kong, and I actually didn't tell anybody in my new post that I was pregnant for about 5 months. And when I finally told them, they said, thank God, because we thought you just really liked Chinese food because you were just getting fatter and fatter. So I said, no, I'm pregnant. And of course, I worried about it through the whole 5 months, and of course, it was perfectly fine, and it ended up to be a great place to have kids. So that was the first couple years in Hong Kong. Living in Asia, and I'll talk a little bit about how that really changed my life. But living in Asia was a fantastic experience. I know that getting that global experience now is much more common than it was back when I graduated from Darden. But I would just say, if you ever have the opportunity, and many of you I know already have global experience when you come into Darden, but if you have the opportunity to do it, you absolutely should do it. And the next thing that I did in Hong Kong, actually another Darden connection, one of my classmates from 1988, Tom Neer, had started a coffee company in Hong Kong. So we had one coffee shop. This was before Starbucks. Starbucks did not exist in Asia. It existed here in the United States on a pretty limited basis, but Tom was from Seattle. And so this is something he'd always wanted to do. He worked for Compaq at the time, a computer company that no longer exists. He left, started this coffee company. And at that point, I had my second child, and he said, well, and I was traveling everywhere in the region. It was a regional job, and 2.5-year-old and a 6-month-old. I said, yeah, I really can't do this anymore. My husband was traveling. He was working for Citibank by then. And so he said, just come and work on this coffee company. It'll be great. You can do marketing. It'll be so much better work-life balance. I think it was before we even had that idea of work-life balance. But anyway, he said, come and do this. It'll be so much calmer. I said, okay. So it was not much calmer. We opened 20 stores in the space of about 2.5 years in Hong Kong and a couple in Singapore. I did get to see my kids more because I would drag them off to all the coffee stores, and as we were, opening them up because nobody showed up, and we were, trying to do this, that, and the other thing, and I did a little tiny bit of marketing, but virtually no marketing. But it was a great experience, a fantastic experience. Just learning how to, first of all, start a business and get it up and running, doing it in another country, and figuring out how are you going to make that work. It was a fantastic experience. We sold that business a couple years later to a Chinese investor. It's now, if you go to Asia, you will see it everywhere. It's all over Asia. It's in China, all over China, Singapore, Hong Kong. So a great experience, another Darden connection. Would have never happened if I hadn't gone to school with Tom. But the real thing that during that time in Asia really changed my life was that we traveled extensively in Asia with our 2 little kids. And you know, when you travel in a place like the Philippines or Thailand or South Korea or any of the many places, Vietnam, southern China, you really do see a different kind of poverty than what you see here in the United States. It's not that we don't have poverty here in the United States. We have plenty of poverty here in the United States, but it really is quite different there, and very much evident in many of the countries where we traveled. So the real difference between we had these two little kids. They could do whatever they wanted. They had two highly educated parents who had good jobs, who could give them everything. And the kids that we met around the world, around the region, they were just as cute, they were, you know, just as bright, they had just as much capability, but they would never get the opportunities that my children had, just never, because they were born to poor people, they lived in very difficult conditions, and so that is really what really changed my mind about what I wanted to do. And there was actually one particular moment. I think a lot of us who go in different directions with our careers can kind of come back and think about, you know, there's one moment when things kind of changed. And for me, it was, we were in the Philippines, we were on vacation, we had our two kids with us, and we were driving from the airport in Manila to the airport to Manila, to the main city. And all along that road, if any of you have ever driven on it, there are people who come up to the cars and beg at every stoplight. And so we were driving down the road, and a woman, we stopped at a stoplight, and a woman came up to the car, and she had a baby in her arms. I was sitting with my son Patrick in my arms, and he was about 6 or 7 months old. She had a baby that was the same age, looked about the same age, didn't look nearly as healthy as my child did, but, you know, a baby who was about the same age. And looking at her, we actually looked at each other through the window, and she never did knock on the window, but I think at that moment, for me, that realization that there are millions of children that are growing up in the world that have absolutely no opportunity for a better life. That's when it really, really struck me. And I really did, my career just took a very different path from there. And started doing a lot of volunteer work in Hong Kong. And though I knew nothing about nonprofits, I had decided when we came back to the United States that that was the direction that I wanted to go. And just had this sense that with the training that I had, there must be something that I could do in a nonprofit organization. And I was very committed to the issue of children and them having an opportunity to have a better life. So that's what then led me on this search. There was another Darden connection, another Darden alum who actually knew somebody at Save the Children. We moved back to Connecticut, which is where Save the Children's headquarters, and I was looking at opportunities in UNICEF and Save the Children and a couple of other large nonprofits. And he said, you know, I know somebody, and go talk to them. And that was 15 years ago. So another Darden connection that kind of made that connection for me to take that path. And I have to say, if you'd asked me the first year when I was working for Save the Children, would I be here 15 years later as the CEO? I probably would have said, not on your life. I will never make it that long. It is a very different culture inside of nonprofits, and it was one that I had worked in very large business, right, in American Express, and I had worked in my own business, a very small business. But nonprofit was a totally different culture, and so it took me a long time to kind of really understand that culture. And the best thing that happened, I think, was, for me, there was a job inside of Save the Children that actually pulled on the experiences I had at American Express. It was on doing direct response television, doing some direct mail to raise money, doing marketing, basically, for Save the Children. And because I knew how to do that, and I could actually translate that into Save the Children's work, I could hang on to that while I tried to figure out all of these other things about what Save the Children was all about. And I have to tell you, it is a fantastic organization. It is, we work in 120 countries around the world. I've been to about 70 of them at this point in time. We work in health, education, economic opportunities for kids, HIV/AIDS programs in Africa. But at the heart of our mission is to really do two things. One is to not only change the circumstances for kids today, so not only do we do relief work, do we do health work and development work, education work, but also to change the way the world thinks about children and children's rights. And the organization was founded on this idea that kids actually have rights. They have the right to actually survive, so they have the right to get out of childhood and be an adult. They have the right to an education. They have a right to be protected and to be safe. And so that's really what the organization is founded on. And so we spend all of our time really focused on that idea and on kids. And great organization, about 15,000 people who work for Save the Children around the world. It's about a $1.8 billion enterprise now around the world. So it's big, it's diverse, it's got all the issues that you would have in any multinational kind of organization. And it's got this added element of really being all about the mission. And there's nobody that works at Save the Children that's not committed to the mission of what the organization does, because you work very hard and very long and not for much money, and so comparatively, so it really is about the mission of being there. But I can't really think of anything that there is absolutely nothing I would rather be doing than running this organization. So that's a little bit about a little bit of a windy path of how I got to Save the Children. And I thought I'd talk for another, not too long, because I want to give you guys an opportunity to ask questions, but maybe for about 10 minutes about a current issue that we're dealing with that's very challenging, which is Syria. And we've actually, Save the Children's been working in Syria and in surrounding countries for 2.5 years. And what people don't realize is that this crisis actually started 2.5 years ago when the current president, Bashir al-Assad, basically said, all that stuff that's happening with the Arab Spring, it's not going to happen here in Syria. And he started really cracking down in his country. And people obviously started rebelling, and it's a very, very complicated situation there. There are many, many actors. It is very hard to figure out how to help, where to help, who to help. But the thing that we have been doing is to try to get humanitarian aid to Syrian civilians. And those are the major people who are impacted by this crisis. So there are 2 million refugees now from Syria. 2 million of their citizens have left the country. 1 million of them are children. They are in 5 surrounding countries where Save the Children is working in all of these. They're in Turkey, they're in Iraq, they're in Jordan, they're in Egypt, and they are in, what am I forgetting, Jordan. So they're in all of those countries, large-scale refugee camps that are set up there for refugees. Lots and lots of issues in terms of supplying food, water, education. Again, these are people who have been living in these camps for about 2 years now. So it is not a temporary thing. Large-scale problems in those areas. And then we're working inside of Syria, and that is extremely difficult. As I said, difficult to figure out how to help, difficult to keep our staff safe, difficult to figure out who to help. But we have been able to get aid inside Syria, mostly over the Turkish border from the north. And then also we're starting to work over the Jordanian border. So very, very difficult situation. And I thought I'd talk about 3 things about leadership that might be relevant to this situation. I think the first is that in any kind of crisis like this, one of the most important things I think for a leader to do is to really understand the challenges that are being faced by your teams on the ground. But wherever that team happens, if that's a sales team or that's a marketing team or that's an operations team, for us it's the team that's in the field. And so I have spent a lot of time in the region. I've taken 4 trips in the last about 8 months, and before that had taken quite a few before, to our refugee camp work in Jordan, to our refugee camp work in Iraq, to inside Syria, and to Lebanon. And the first thing you have to really do is understand what are people going through, what are the challenges that they are going through, and how can you help them. And as the leader of an organization, the expectation is you know what's going on, you know what the challenges are, and you are working at the highest level to try to make those challenges easier. So really understanding what's going on has been extremely important. And there really is nothing that can take the place of you being there with your team on the ground, understanding what's going on. So, you know, an example, when I was, so the last place that I was Iraq earlier this summer, and we were in a refugee camp right on the border of Iraq and Syria called Damiz, which was built for 10,000 people. It had 50,000 people when I was there. Incredibly overcrowded, children with absolutely nothing to do, no opportunities to go to school. The school was built for about 4,000 kids. There were close to 20,000 children there when I was there. And so understanding those things on the ground and then trying to do something about it. So I'll give you some examples of what, as a leader, then you need to do. So last night, I was at a dinner in New York with Ban Ki-moon, who is the Secretary General of the UN, and it was a small dinner at the home of Andrew Tisch, who is Lowe's Corporation chairman. And we talked about how do we get more support for the humanitarian issues that are happening. Everybody talks about chemical weapons. Everybody talks about what to do about chemical weapons, but the real crisis here is about the humanitarian issues that are going on in Syria and the almost total destruction of this country. And so whatever happens with chemical weapons and whatever happens with the longer-term political solution, you have a country that is a complete mess and a civilian population that has been really decimated. So that's one thing that I've done on the issue. The second thing is, earlier this week I was on the phone with the UN High Commissioner of Refugees, so that's the UN organization that supports a lot of the work in the camps, and talking to him about how can we do more together? How do we make sure that our teams, so they've got a big team on the ground, we've got a big team on the ground, let's make sure they're working in lockstep and they're doing everything they can together. So really understanding what's going on the ground, and then looking at what can you as a leader actually do about that particular issue. That's a really important thing. The second kind of element of leadership that I would bring up in this particular case is you need a strategy and it needs to be flexible. And Syria is a key example of where our strategy has changed quite a bit. At the base of our strategy are two basic things. One is we have to supply immediate support to the civilians in Syria that are suffering. So much of our work is about that, the humanitarian aid. But we also have to make sure that people know what's going on the ground to try to influence the longer-term political situation. Because at the end of the day, we can pour, and already are, billions of dollars of aid into Syria. It is not going to matter if we don't come up with some kind of longer-term solution. So Save the Children's role in that kind of work is not to say what it is we want to do. It's not to say there should be a military strike or there should be this. It is to be a witness to what's happening to children. So a lot of our work is documenting, in addition to that support that we provide every single day, is documenting what's happening to kids. So it's horrible that 400 plus kids were gassed during the chemical attack, and I certainly believe that is in fact what happened, but there are 10,000 kids that have been killed over the last 2 years. They have been shelled, they have been shot, they have been tortured, many horrible things that have happened to children. So part of our work is to make sure that people know what the facts are, to actually talk with kids, and when I go, I sit and I talk with families and I talk with children, and I understand what they're going through. And so this latest kind of, element with inside Syria, the whole chemical weapons piece, our strategy stays the same, but our tactics might be different. And so one of the things we were talking about last night is there's a lot more awareness in the United States now about Syria. It's because of chemical weapons, but it does give us an opportunity to talk about the humanitarian situation. And so we have collectively said we really need to get that understanding of what's happening in Syria from a real humanitarian situation out there. So you need a strategy, you need to keep that strategy and the base of that strategy strong, but you need to be flexible, and you need to look at what's happening in the external world that can help me move that strategy ahead. And Syria, as I said, the chemical weapons piece to us is the perfect example. So that's the second thing. The third thing that's so important, and I touched on it a little bit earlier, is this idea of partnership. And this idea that when you are in a crisis, particularly this, for us, this kind of a crisis, a large humanitarian crisis where, frankly, we are struggling to be able to meet the needs of the people we're trying to meet, it is really important to reach out to others who can help you. So this idea of partnerships, and to say, who else is it that we work with, or that we know, or that we could get to support the work that we do. And so this idea of partnerships is incredibly important. For us, that could be UNHCR, who's on the ground with us in the camps. It could be our board, we have a fantastic board made up mostly of corporate leaders. Ann Mulcahy, who used to run Xerox, is our board chair. How can they help us really get to those people who can do something about Syria, either in the short term or in the long term? How do we get to them? How do we use our connections to talk to? We've spent a lot of time in the last couple of weeks, again, documenting the issues for children and getting it in front of congressmen of the US Congress. So making sure that they understand, not advocating for any one solution, but saying you need to understand what's going on in these countries and in these camps and for children in Syria. So using all the connections that you have to try to do that, and calling on many, many partners, because Save the Children's large, we're very big, we're very diverse, and we're out in most of these countries, but in the scheme of things, we are tiny in the scheme of things in terms of the issues that we are trying to really attack. So you've got to bring in other people, and you've got to get on the phone and call those people and go visit them and enlist their help, because that idea of partnerships is the only way you're going to actually move your strategy ahead. So that's just three things that I think, for me as a leader in this particular case, have been really, really important. This idea of making sure that you bring in partners, making sure that you have a flexible strategy, and making sure that I know what's going on the ground, and I have immersed myself in what's going on the ground. Those are three lessons that I think, for me as a leader in something that's happening to me right now, that I wanted to share with you, and three things that I think you can relate to all sorts of other things, because I know many of you, I'm sure, are interested in the nonprofit world, but I'm sure many of you are going to go on to other careers and in other directions. So I think I'll end there and open it up to questions, because I'd love to take any questions that you have about anything I talked about, or career-wise, or anything else. So, yep.
Make sure if you guys get the mic that you speak loud into it, because we have folks in the other room. So.
Thank you so much for coming.
Sure.
Can you hear me?
I can. Yep.
Okay, I wanted to ask, how did you make that shift from the corporate world to the nonprofit world, and some survival tips?
Survival tips. Well, I think the biggest survival tip is I talked a little bit about it when I talked earlier. I think, first of all, there's a lot of people who look at the nonprofit world and say, I have people every day who come into my office and say, I'll do anything. I just want to come work for Save the Children. I'll do anything. And my response is always the same. I don't want you to do anything. I want you to do what you're good at. Because what I need is people who are really good at what they do to come work for Save the Children, right? So having a skill set that's valuable to that organization that you want to go work for, or to a nonprofit, is really important. Now, the good news is large nonprofits like Save the Children need lots of people who are good at lots of different things. We need good, experts in health programs and education programs. We also need good finance people. We need a good IT person. We have 65 country offices around the world that have to be, brought together from a technology standpoint, right? So having a skill set that's relevant to that organization is the first thing that you have to be sure that you have. And then I would say that part of the survival is You come in with a set of skills, you have a job that you're doing inside that organization, do that job as best you can and try to bring new things to that organization, and then take time to learn, particularly if you're coming from the corporate world. It is quite a different world, and so taking the time to learn, what does the organization really do, how does it really work, what are their finances like, what really kind of makes the thing go, who are the people who really have the most sway in the organization, all those things that you would try to figure out in any organization. Take the time, try to learn it. I would say keep your mouth shut a lot if you're coming from the outside, because a lot of people have worked in that organization for a long time. They know a lot, and obviously contribute when you can, but really try to learn in those initial days. But come in with a skill that you know is going to add value right away. Don't just assume I'll come in and I'll figure out what I'm going to do to add value. So, okay, we got a lot of questions. Maybe guy in the red. Yep. Unless do you guys want to pick who gets picked? Okay.
So in your organization, there's a lot of conflicts and problems that perhaps defy easy resolution.
Yes.
And also defy a timeline for resolution. So how do you define success?
Yeah.
Excuse me. How do you define success and say, we've accomplished our mission, or we've accomplished a portion of our mission?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think more and more nonprofits are really focusing on this idea of outcomes. It's not good enough that we just do good work and we distribute food and water and we have health programs and we have education programs. What are the outcomes that we're actually having for people? So we actually have some of those outcomes are long-term. So our number one global goal is to reduce the number of kids who die in the world under the age of 5 of preventable things. And right now, so that number's gone from 12 million in 1990 to 6.9 million last year, and the new numbers I think are coming out in another couple of weeks. It'll be around 6 million. So good, that's a good result, but it obviously isn't enough. And so we measure that particular indicator at the top. And then the programs that we do are very much focused on specific things that we're trying to accomplish with that project. So we might get a grant that's 3 years, and the grant in that particular community is about, we're trying to train 10,000 teachers, right? And so we will measure our progress against training those 10,000 teachers, and then we'll look at what's the impact in that school of those trained teachers. So it's both the kind of short-term, tangible piece, and then how do we actually measure the impact of those things. But you have to have kind of both these longer-term goals, like over 15 years, we want to reduce the number of kids who are dying of preventable deaths, and you have to have the close-in goals of a particular project. And there's a lot more monitoring of and goal setting now in nonprofits than I think there ever has been. So a lot more about outcomes and really, looking at a return on investment that you're making in these programs and these projects. So, yeah. Okay. Yep, go ahead. Whoever.
Hello, and thank you. It was very, I think, inspiring story. The question I have is about partnerships, but in a different sense.
Sure.
What about partnerships between donors? So let's take your example with 10,000 children. Let's say there is another donor who may be able to give money to build schools.
Yep.
So obviously, if you build schools and train the teachers together in the same location, the benefit that you achieve is a lot bigger. So were you able, what is going on the donor side? On that?
It's another good question, and I think actually one of the things, so a lot more of those partnerships, coalitions or partnership frameworks that are out there for people to actually do things together. And a lot of times the donors are actually pushing us to do that. So they're coming to us and saying, all right, we're going to give some money over here to Save the Children, we're going to give some money to Here to Care, we're going to give some money to Mercy Corps, but you guys actually have to work together. And you have to actually sit down and plan together, you have to figure out your goals together, you have to figure out your outcomes, you have to measure things together. And that's a trend that actually is happening more and more. And I think one that's extremely healthy, because too often things are kind of in these stovepipes and they're off kind of by themselves. And And so you really do need to do that. The other area for partnership, which is really relevant, I think, to you all, is partnerships with corporations. I mean, more and more of our work is now with large corporations where, again, we set a high-level goal. So I'll use an example. GlaxoSmithKline is a big corporate partner with us, and they don't write us a check. We sit down together and we say, our goal is actually to save the lives of 1 million children over the next 5 years. How are we going to do it? They have developed new products within GlaxoSmithKline that can, particularly address the issues of newborns in some of the countries where we work. They've lowered their pricing on some of their products so that we can actually get them into these countries. They've worked on advocacy with us, with governments. So they've gone to the Nigerian government with us to work with them to say, these are some of the things that we want to happen. They've engaged their employees to get involved, raise funds. They've engaged their customers. So those are the kinds of partnerships that you're now seeing with corporations. It is not, I'm going to write a check to save the children and check off my box about my philanthropy, right? It doesn't look like that at all. It still looks like that in some places, but most companies, it doesn't look like that. So big growth there.
Thank you. I'm very curious. Thank you, first of all, for the presentation. I'm curious, how do you prioritize which children to help? Because there are billion children probably hungry around the world.
Yes.
Do you help the hungriest, or how do you assess need?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. It is a combination, I would say, of a couple things. One is, where do we, Save the Children, have capacity on the ground? So again, we have 65 countries where we have offices where we do programs on the ground. So where do we have those? Those are in the poorest countries. They're in the countries with the worst statistics already. So that's one thing. Where can we get donors to give us money? Save the Children raises all the money that we use. So that $1.6 billion that I talked about, probably about half of that is ongoing funding, and half of that we raise every year, fundraising. So that is a huge operation, obviously, but the donors have ideas on what they want to do, and they will give you money for a lot of times quite specific things. So convincing the donors that this is the place that we have to work. And then the third thing is, it's got to be a place where the government wants us to be there. We do not go into countries where the government doesn't want us to be there. Now, you've got situations like Syria, where if you sat the government down and asked them, did they really want Save the Children to be there? They might say no, but they don't stand in our way when we're doing humanitarian work there. If it wasn't a humanitarian situation, we had not worked there before this crisis, so they had not wanted Save the Children there. But you do have to have the ability to keep your staff safe, to keep your operations running, and the government, there's a key role there. So that combination, it sometimes gets to the children who need the help most. It doesn't always get to the children that need the help most. But there's an awful lot of kids that still, we have very limited opportunities. So we haven't run into the situation yet where we've had the money and the will and the okay by the government, and we haven't found any children that we could serve. So far we've been okay with that. So but it is tough. And I think as we get better at, those numbers I talked about on child survival, going from 12 million kids that die under the age of 5 to 6, now you're down to the hard to reach kids. You are down to the kids who are in remote areas, who are in very, very poor urban slums, who are in the hardest to reach places now, because we've done the so-called easy part, right? We've done the work that reaches those 6 million kids that we could save that were easier than the other 6. And so this is the place where the really hard work has to happen. And again, I think it's the reason that partnerships are going to be, back to the other question, they're going to be so important, because we will not reach those kids unless we do those things together. So.
Hi, my question is about Syria. How are you and some other aid organizations that are working in Syria dealing with the fact that a lot of the rebel groups are arguably just as violent as the government themselves, especially given the proliferation of a lot of extreme organizations that have resurged in recent months?
Yeah, that's what makes Syria so difficult. There's not a clear-cut good guys, bad guys. It's it's very difficult to tell. Our work inside Syria, so a couple things that we've done. One is we've worked with some local partners that we actually know, who are there on the ground, who are parts of organizations that we know from around the world. So we have some trust built in with those local partners. We've worked in both rebel-held and government-held areas. So we have tried not to, it really has been about where are the needs. So where are the places where, you know, these are the places that have been bombed, and we know there are people living in schools, and we know there are people without access to food, and we know the bakeries have all been destroyed, and you know, we know there's no water system left. And so then it really is about who are the people that are in need. But it is very, very difficult. And the local partners that we work with are probably the only thing that we really have to, that we can totally depend on. I would say though, at the end of the day, whether this person happens to support the government or this person happens to support the rebels, if they are a civilian that's in trouble, we're going to help them. So you don't take sides in those kinds of situations. So I think we're going down here. We'll come up there.
Thanks. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to describe your formal or more informal relationships with like international quasi or governmental organizations like the World Bank.
Sure.
Or USAID, on the other hand.
Yeah. So both the World Bank, maybe I'll start with USAID. USAID is a big donor to Save the Children. So it depends on the year, but on any year, probably 30% of our funding comes from USAID. So they're an important donor. We work very closely with them. We know them quite well. We don't always agree with them, but we have a good working relationship. And one of the things that I do actually is there's a coalition in Washington. So this is a good example of how you have to bring together different kinds of partners. It's a coalition made up of organizations like ours, NGOs, corporate leaders, and retired military generals. And that coalition has one goal, and that is to advocate for what they call the 150 account, which is basically the account in the U.S. government that supports the Peace Corps, it supports the UN, and it supports USAID in all their programs. And so it's about less than 1% of the federal budget. It is one that is constantly attacked. You will hear many people say, let's just cut foreign aid and all of our problems will be solved. Well, it's less than 1% of the federal budget, so it's probably not going to happen. And it's a lot of money that goes into very good, it's not a lot of money, it's a little bit of money that goes into a lot of very good things. So that's one of the things that we work with USAID on. We also are working really closely with them right now on food security. They've got a program called Feed the Future, which is about food security around the world. And so we're doing a lot of work, particularly around malnutrition for children and the impact it has on both mortality rates and learning outcomes for kids. So there's a lot of data around that. So we work really closely with them. World Bank is probably not as big a partner for us. We do a little bit of funding work with them, but they're a bigger partner on the research side. So they fund a lot of research into development issues and really looking at kind of what's working. And they have money to be able to look over 10 years at programs, for example. So we've just done a study with them on the impact of preschool for kids in Latin America. So people might think preschool, you know, it's a luxury. Why would we spend anything on preschool for poor kids in Latin America? But what they found in that 10-year study is that the outcomes for kids in elementary school and primary school was so much better if they had a year of preschool. So it's an economic argument. The World Bank is really good at making those. So that's where we have partnered with people like the World Bank. So.
Back a little bit. If you look over the last 15 years working for a major nonprofit, what challenges kind of have come up in the last 3, 4, 5 years that you didn't face 15 years ago, outside of isolated ones, let's say, of
Sure,
Syria and so forth, but in the larger spectrum?
Yeah, I think the more systemic challenges that we're facing right now, there's a couple things. One is, you know, it's become a much more crowded space. So how do you really add value? So there's a lot more people doing, whether you're talking about emergency response work or you're talking about development work like what we do, a lot more people out there, a lot more nonprofits out there. So how do you distinguish yourself? That's kind of a classic, how do we distinguish what we do versus what everybody else does? That's one thing. For us, it's also been about a global structure and a global organization. We actually have 30 different Save the Children's around the world, and we work in 90 different places collectively. So we've spent a lot of time on how do we actually bring that whole thing actually together in some kind of global organization. So we've spent a lot of time on that. That's kind of an internal thing. Externally, I would say the other challenges, there's lots of challenges on the funding side, lots of pressure on governments, not just here in the United States, but we get funding from every government, every developed government in the world. All of them have tremendous pressure on the amount of funding that they're giving for what they call foreign aid. So a lot of pressure there. I think the whole piece we talked about outcomes earlier, I think that's been a real challenge in terms of, actually measuring the outcomes of what we do is not so easy. There's so many different factors, and being able to actually look over time at the outcomes that you're having, that's been a big challenge. But I think we've made a lot of progress. But that's another trend, I would say, that's out there, that's been challenging. Yep.
My question builds on the accountability question from earlier, but in this room there are surely going to be people who have either personal wealth or who can impact corporate giving strategies in the future.
Yep.
So knowing for a well-reputed nonprofit organization, do you think it is more beneficial to you to have partners sort of mark their spending for a specific purpose as another form of accountability? Or do you see more benefit when that money is given in open funds because it allows flexibility? Like, what sort of balance do you think you can advise us on?
Yeah, that is definitely one of the other trends in terms of challenges that we see. So this idea that I want to give all my money for that project right there with these outcomes. On the one hand, that's great, but you have to run the organization. And right now, the percentage of our funding that is unrestricted, that's really is 5%. So we run $1.6 billion organization on 5%. That's basically the unrestricted funding, and everything else is restricted. That's really challenging. What I think the answer is a combination of the two. And I talked a little bit about it earlier with these global partnerships that we're doing with corporations. You start with a goal. And you say, this is the goal that together we want to achieve. We want to save the lives of 1 million children over the next 5 years. That's what we want to do. That's going to take both some very specific restricted funding that goes into these particular things. It's also going to take some funding that might build capability across the organization to do some things that you're not doing right now. What I've found is that when you sit down with a partner, first of all, if you're talking about longer term, so you're talking about 5 years, you're talking about relatively large, GlaxoSmithKline's a $25 million commitment over 5 years. So you're talking about some funding that makes a difference. You're talking about a high-level goal that you're then going to do things underneath to drive that goal. Those conversations are the ones that are leading us to better outcomes and better impact, I think, because they recognize the fact that you can't do all this without some support to the overall organization to accomplish them. And as long as you're accomplishing your goals, you shouldn't care about that. There's kind of an obsession in the United States of how much money does a nonprofit spend on their overhead or their fundraising. At the end of the day, and we have good metrics, ours is between 85 and 90% to programs, but at the end of the day, it should be about what I accomplish, not how much I spend on my overhead rate. It should be on what do I actually get done. And so starting the conversation with what am I trying to accomplish is the way, I think, to get to the point where you can both support the organization, but most importantly, you get to the goals that you've set. And that's really important. So, and I do think that's an area where the business world can be immensely helpful to nonprofits, is how do we get better at that? How do we get better at understanding those outcomes and measuring those outcomes? So.
First off, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I will definitely be asking about where that beer truck is.
Yeah. I'm sure they don't have it anymore, but anyway.
My question is more personal for you. As president and CEO of a 15,000 person company with 120 countries.
Yep.
How do you balance your own efforts within the company, within the organization? Because you can't focus on
Right.
the small stuff, but you can't.
Yep.
You also have to have that work-life balance as well.
Yeah. Well, work-life balance I've given up on a little bit, but anyway, I do mix those things. I mean, for me, some people are like, I'm working, I'm home, I separate those. I'm not very good at that, so everything gets mingled up. But I take my kids to go see our programs and things like that. So, but I think the key there is you got to hire the right people. So it's not any different than any other big global organization. You need a senior team who are really good, and you need to depend on that senior team to do most all of the day-to-day stuff. And so at the leadership level, it's really about where can I make a difference. So the things I talked about with Syria, I'm probably the only one that can go to the dinner with Ban Ki-moon. I'm probably the only one who can call the guy from UNHCR up, the High Commissioner, and talk to him. There are things that only the leader of the organization is going to be able to do. You need to make sure you're spending your time on those. I spend a lot of time with our donors and our partners because they want to know who's running the organization. They're not going to put their money into it unless they know that person. So it's being, I think, clear on what are the things that the leader of the organization can do, that you as the leader can do, and doing those things, and then getting engaged enough with your team to support them, to know what they're doing, to not just kind of cheerlead on a general basis, but really understand kind of what are they up against and try to help them, achieve those things. And a really, really strong senior team is really important. So I do spend time looking for the right people because I think that in the end, that's where you're going to get the biggest, return on your time. So. Mm-hmm.
So given the importance of funding coupled with how competitive the nonprofit sector is, what core marketing principles do you feel is most important, and how have you personally utilized those in your message to get people to obviously donate?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is this idea of accountability is really important, and transparency. I think the first thing that somebody has, so people who support Save the Children do it, first of all, because they care about the mission. So you have to be good at talking about the mission and making that come alive for people. I mean, most of the work we do is way far away somewhere else. It's not work that people can see. Even here in the United States, and we do work in the US in 18 states, it's not where most of our donors live. So they won't, the vast majority will never see it. So how do you make it real for people? How do you tell those stories about individual kids? How do you tell the big picture about the scale? All of those things. Telling the stories is really important to make it real for people. And then I think once they believe in the mission, which I mean most people do believe in children, so we have a pretty good step in the right direction. But then they have to trust the organization, and then they have to believe that this is an organization that's actually does what they say they do. They deliver outcomes. They not only have great people, but they actually have competent people, those kinds of things. And so I think those are the two most important things. Get people to feel the mission, and from a marketing standpoint, get them to feel the mission, and then make sure they understand what you do around accountability and transparency and how seriously you take it, and not just kind of say it, but actually show them how you do it. So go look at our website and you can tell me whether we're doing it well enough.
So for the sake of time, I think this is going to be the final question.
Okay.
This is related to the question that Jenny asked. I want to know how the economic crisis in 2008-9, how did that affect your funding purposes? How did that change your leadership strategy? And did you have to come up with partnerships, or what strategies did you foresee? Thanks.
Yeah, it was actually, I mean, looking back on 2008, 2009, first of all, it was a tough time. So we laid people off. I mean, all of a sudden the people were not giving the way they had, and we can't run our organization, without the funding. As I said, we raise half of it every year. So we had to lay people off, but that was, people do understand that. So we had to do that. That's painful. But it really did also, I think, force us to look at how do we further diversify the way in which we raise money? So we can't, one of the things that, and we had started to do a lot of this before then, but I think we really accelerated that. So, the funding stream that Save the Children has comes from individuals, from $10 donors to $10 million donors, right? Individuals. We have foundations that support the organization. We have corporations. About half of the Fortune 500 support us in some way, with either funding or people or gift in kind or something. The government, obviously, as I said. And then looking at, are there new ways for us to partner? Are there new ways for us to actually raise money together? So one of the things that we do in some of the places where we raise money is we actually do it in a combined way. So when there's an emergency, we don't all go out and kind of raise our money individually. We actually do it collectively. We haven't been able to do that in the United States because it's very competitive in the United States. But if you go to the UK, you'll see something called the Disaster Emergency Coalition. And when an emergency hits, they go out with one message, they raise money, and it gets split up between the people, the organizations that are working on that disaster. It's a good model. We have not been able to figure out how to do it here in the United States. So, but we haven't given up. So.
All right, well,
okay.
If you could join me in thanking Carolyn again.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. And I think I can hang out for a few minutes. If you guys have any other questions and you want to come down individually, that's fine. So, but I think somebody has to go to class, probably, right? Do you guys have to go to class? So, thank you.